This will be a podcast on all your favorite platforms under the Lead Lag Live banner. So stay tuned for that. My name is Michael Guyett, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Neely Tamminga, who I'm sure many of you have seen in these spaces. I'm a huge fan of Neely's as I've gotten to know her a bit over the last several months here. Neely, for those who are not familiar with your background, introduce yourself more formally. Who are you? How did you get involved in Wall Street, and what are you doing with Distill?
What is a Neely, right? I love it. Michael, just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. You're such a kind and generous human. I echo that back. I'm a huge fan of what you've been doing on these spaces. And it is such a joy to kick off this Monday and this crazy week with you. So thanks everybody for joining. So, Wall Street is my background. I was on Wall Street for 20 plus years. I was head of the consumer research practice over at Piper Jaffray, which is now known as Piper Sandler. And there we did a lot of fun and great research, probably most notably that's widely read still to this day because it still goes on. That's the annual Taking Stock with Teens survey product. I was actually one of the original authors of that. If you ever see that floating around, I was part of the original author group of that product. One of the longest longitudinal studies of teen behavior, spending behavior in existence. So that's what we're known for, consumer-centric research. And then, at the end of 16, with the implementation of MiFID II, which I won't go into because that'll just bore everybody out of this space. But it became very clear to me that to do what I wanted to do and to do it well, and that's research and really think about big things and do deep thinking, I was going to have to try to find a different place for it. What was beautiful is the prior 4 to 5 years before I made that pivot, we were getting invited into boardrooms to actually talk about the white papers and the big research projects that we were producing. And so it really sparked this aha that boards need help. They need independent thinking, big picture research, where they could test out their ideas in safer spaces, that there are natural gaps in education that exist on boards. And so we thought, well, could we maybe be that? That doesn't really exist. Could we create that? So we launched Distill in 2017 with that idea that we would be this bespoke research advisory service for CEOs and boards. And that's what we're still doing here into 2022, going into 2023. Our first client still retains us. So, we're having a lot of fun doing this. I have a co-founder, Kayla Wester, who is not on Twitter because she is wiser with her time than with me. But we do this with a little bit of extra help from some of our friends. And we're kind of a SEAL Team 6 solution for research for boards. So it's a ton of fun, but I get to live and breathe and think about consumer behavior all day, every day. And that truly is my joy.
Let's define what consumer behavior actually means for a moment. Are we talking about spending patterns? Are we talking about different views on what matters in terms of what one buys or doesn't buy? Talk about what that actually means in practice.
All consumer behavior begins with an economic reality, and it considers a life stage priority. So it's not uncommon to have, lots of people talking about consumer insights or consumer behavior. But what we found is they'll have, a zillion people that can go into the boardroom and say, oh, hey, millennials like pink and Gen Z likes yellow and these people are digitally native and they like these different brands. And, they kind of get into the softer side of behaviors. But nobody really was able to bridge the both and. Can millennials and Gen Zers actually afford the items that were being produced and what have you? So we think that consumer behavior is a consideration of both like a hard economic reality as well as a life stage priority or preference or proclivity. And we do deep study of those two things. Said very simply, we ask two very basic questions of our work. Does the consumer have cash? There's a ton of quantitative models behind that question and statement. Which consumer at what point on one categories, et cetera. Like we actually have rigor behind that. But does the consumer have cash? Do they want to spend it on what and why? And our our 24/7, 365 practice answers those two questions.
All right, so let's go to that point on consumer cash, and we'll get into some of the different topics from the thread that you put out. But what are some of the metrics that you look at when it comes to that question of consumer cash? Because I think a lot of people will throw out that term that there's a lot of quote unquote cash on the sidelines. How valid is that? What are the metrics that matter the most, and where are we today on that?
Really good question. Probably don't have enough time in this space to tackle all of that, but let me just boil it down to simplicity here. First and foremost, it's employment, right? Does the consumer have a job? Because if you have a job, you feel secure with what your payment cycle is going to be. And so, let's call that the P&L, right, of the customer, the income statement of the customer. Or do they have jobs and do they have wages? That is something that we obviously study very closely on, all the different jobs related metrics that come out on a weekly and a monthly basis. But then beyond that, it's really getting into what is then taken away from that wage. CPI, which was wildly not discussed for 40 years, is now the hottest topic. Of course, we have that this week with CPI. But the cost of things that you need to buy, what's going on with that? Because that constrains your ability on the things that you want to buy, right? If the things that you need to buy are greater today than it was a year ago. And that's certainly the case. And that actually affects different income demographics differently. And we have built proprietary models that help companies consider through those different income profiles. And then where I think we're going to spend a little time today is what's around the corner. So a lot of FinTwit spends time on monetary policy, and that's understandable because it's definitely all the rage with interest rates and what's going on with the Fed. But we spend, obviously we care about what's going on with interest rates because that affects the ability to consume as well, can constrain the capacity to consume if the cost of your debt moves higher. But then also there's fiscal policy. So we spend just as much time in fiscal policy as we do monetary policy because taxes are a huge component too of what people have to pay or not pay. And we've made some pretty out of consensus calls with our clients, as it were, on kind of really following the fiscal policy component. So it's both and fiscal and monetary.
Okay, so that's a good transition to the link between what you shared in the federal deficit and consumer jobs. Talk about where we are in the cycle for the deficit broadly and why it matters for consumer spending power.
You bet. So just for anyone who's following along, or if this is the first time you've hung out in a space, there is a tweet thread. It's an extensive one, but I did that just for Michael and for this space so that everybody has pictures and not just words or conjecture. And you'll see it's all primary research. It's all the research that we've put out. And this is work that we've shared with our clients. So you get to get a little glimpse into what it is that we do. There's 4 primary questions that we're asking and discussing in leadership teams and boards this year. And it goes around that idea of like, what is consumer capacity to spend? And we do believe that one thing that needs to be discussed is this federal deficit issue. So the federal deficit at the end of the first 11 months of the fiscal year 2022, which was August, in early September was reported, and you can see this in the chart that we provided in that tweet thread, that we were just under $1 trillion in our federal fiscal deficit. And again, very simply, if anyone's listening, you're like, what is a federal fiscal deficit all about? It's the same thing with the government. Like, how much are they bringing in from taxes, right? And then how much do they have to spend out because of their programs? What's passed by law with Congress for them to spend? And a deficit, of course, means that they are taking in less than what they're spending out. And we typically run in a deficit, and we have been for pretty much most of the last couple decades, right? Or longer. So that's not uncommon. The idea, though, is the significant, surprising rise in the federal fiscal deficit. We started to flag this over the summer, that we were moving a little bit faster in the deficit than what we had maybe appreciated at that time. And we've gone from about $1 trillion to $1.4 trillion in the federal fiscal deficit for last year. It is an improvement when you look at it on a year-over-year basis, but the last 2 years were, kind of abnormal years because of the spending stimulus from the pandemic. The question is, I think if you zoom out and go back to the GFC timeframe, 2008, 2009, we're starting to creep up to the federal deficit levels where we were back in that 09, 10, 11 sort of time frame. Why does that matter? Well, because we don't have a passed budget yet for the government for 23. Okay, so that's one key thing. We don't have actually a reconciled budget of the things that we need to raise for tax receipts and the things that we need to spend on. P.S. The debt servicing costs have only gone higher since the last time we've reconciled our budget because of the Fed and the Fed's moves. So that's going to be an issue. And then we still haven't really addressed our debt ceiling, which I think we're kind of nearing substantially and pretty fast here. And that will require some sort of jockeying for position on the other side of the election this week. So it's just a long-winded way of saying we're kind of running out of runway before we have to reconcile this budget. And it's getting a little bit costlier, a little bit faster, which means we probably won't cut programs because that would be like political suicide, right, between now and 2024. But we very likely are going to have to raise some taxes. Raising taxes will affect the consumer's capacity to spend, and if not, possibly cause some corporate job loss. So we're watching for that very closely on the fiscal side.
Yeah, the debt ceiling show, which is, I think, the best way to describe it, it's going to be interesting because aside from the fact that we might have a split government and gridlock, it's going to be, I think, to me, interesting to watch how the public reacts to the realization that you've got high inflation and the debt ceiling keeps on having to be raised. I mean, you can argue the public didn't really care before when inflation was low, but you might have a totally different outlook, as this takes place.
Yeah, we would agree with that. I think what's adding to our concern, and this is really in kind of the third and the fourth tweet of our tweet storm that we put out this morning in the thread above, is we've been positing this idea that tax withholdings, so tax receipts. So that, remember what we said is your deficit comes because you took in tax receipts from, half of those tax receipts come from individual taxpayers. I think corporate taxes are like 8-9% in total. Payroll taxes and other taxes and payments kind of make up for the balance. But a big thing that's been concerning us is we've been weirdly over withholding. If you look at a historical basis, our taxes per employee on a trailing 12-month basis. We think we know in part why that is. There's, I think, a couple different things as we've made deep study of it. But let's just say it really simply this way. It's possible that a new W-4 form caused an administrative change where we are naturally withholding more taxes at the IRS, waiting to be reconciled for tax season. And if that's the case, refund season might be amazing. You know what I mean? So it's like super positive for the consumption patterns if we're right about this thesis come, tax season 2023, but not very great if you're the US government banking on those receipts to offset your spending, which means the deficit could only rocket ship higher relative to expectations. Interestingly enough, Michael, this happened the last time we made the major tax revision changes back in 86. And there's congressional record of them talking about the W-4 form administrative mishap if you go all the way back to that time frame in the mid 80s. This is not the first time this has happened. So we're kind of watching history possibly repeat itself, and it could leave a mark.
So that's interesting. I wonder if part of Powell's tone is because maybe the Fed is somewhat aware that that's a possible outcome, right? And they're trying to front run that by talking even tougher on inflation, because you might have this what looks like a windfall for a moment in time to consumers getting a good chunk of their money back.
Yeah, we think that's absolutely possible. I mean, the CBO, so the Congressional Budget Office, has made mention of this in some of their write-ups as well. So it is a known, it's a known possibility. I'll just put it that way. It's a known possibility. And it just surprises me the lack of journalistic curiosity for people who kind of cover the situation, right? Like why they're not talking more about this. Now, I understand this is tax, it's complicated. I get to spend, all of my days studying this and asking questions and calling the Treasury to confirm some things and things like that. I get that, but I have, confirmed with folks who are pretty familiar. I don't think we're far off on this call. Now, the question is, though, and here's what remains, here's the what do we know versus what do we believe? And now what do we not yet know, right? We always frame up everything in our research in those three buckets. What do we not yet know? As we go to reconcile the budget, if Congress sees what we see and they know what we know, will they have some tax policy changes that essentially kind of capture what it is that they've kept or kept what they've captured? And so then, it gets resolved, but then you don't have the tax refund season being robust. I mean, that's still TBD at this point, but something we're monitoring very closely.
It also seems that in addition to that, the deficit is probably going to explode at some point if you don't have asset markets recover, right? Because you're not going to have capital gains the more that you're more prolonged of a bear market that you're in. How does the government ultimately respond to that dynamic? You've got falling asset prices. You've got consumers, which, while strong, probably start to weaken at some point. It just seems like the issue here is that the starting point of leverage for the government with the deficit is so high that it's a very sort of nasty setup to try and even slow down what could be an explosion of the deficit.
Yeah, this starts to wade into uncharted waters, right? For you and for me and for others. I most definitely believe it's in the interest of the United States of America to not default. I'm sure that we can all get around that. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of political jockeying, though, around what it is to kind of revisit that debt ceiling and what have you. There's even hints of that conversation going around in, reputable journalistic sort of conversations. So I don't know the answer to that question. I do have confidence in I will never short America. I'll never get on the other side of shorting America, and the dream that we are, and I think the ability and capacity that we are. But I think the world, still needs us very much as the reserve currency and what have you. So I don't go down that path of doomsday-ish. But I do think that things can get rocky between now and then, right? As do we go to government shutdowns, and do people not get paid their Social Security benefits for a while? I mean, there could be some real ramifications to them not coming to a consensus or an agreement on that. So I don't know how it all ends, I should say, I don't know the journey, but I'm still optimistic that we'll get to where we need to be.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's just more of a thought experiment as far as how it could, in a worst case scenario, play out. Now, you mentioned probably going to be having higher taxes on consumers, on businesses. I'm going to make the assumption that small business often carries the bulk of that tax burden, aside from the fact that there's more small businesses than large businesses. The large businesses have great accountants and lawyers to try to help them skirt higher rates. How do you think small businesses can respond to the looming threat of higher taxes against the backdrop of labor that still wants to make more money, against the backdrop of, while commodities having fallen, probably resuming their rise again? It seems like from an environmental perspective, challenging to be an entrepreneur and have a successful small business in this kind of environment.
You nailed it for us. I mean, we think about small business all the time. I think what's unique, going back to Distill, what do we do at Distill? We do advise public companies, boards, and CEOs, right? That's the bread and butter of what we do. However, we also have started, in the last 2 years, we've started to make some investments in small business. So what has been fascinating is I've got one foot in small business and helping a company, right? A family-owned business of about 9 employees, right? And kind of navigate the pandemic and everything else, while also advising about small business. And so I think we're very uniquely positioned because we do economy. We don't just talk economy. I mean, I think my business partner, Kayla, she's a CFA, an amazing financial mind. She's like forensic accountant level type mind. She's amazing. I've worked with her for, 11 going on 12 years now. And she really is the superior half of the two of us too, by the way. And the one that's even more qualified than I am. I couldn't even pass level 2 CFA, right? I mean, I was making a lot of money at that time. Admittedly, I didn't have time to study, but mad props to you CFAs. But she has hers. And she probably helped, I think in total, 8 or 9, 10 companies with their kind of PPP, their payroll protection plan, the employee retention credit, like all the different iterations of that. She's very aware and acutely aware of what went on those forms and the navigation that they've had to do. Why am I bringing this up? Because the second question we're asking right here, right now, among leadership teams and boards, public companies, big ones, by the way, like, why would they even care about small business? They care about small business because small business owners are consumers, right? Like, if their world is rocked, if 32 million small businesses' worlds are rocked, you not only have a job loss potential issue, right? You actually have, the confidence of spending getting rocked among small business owners. So I think sometimes people want to disaggregate kind of labor and consumer. That's very traditional, for economists to do that. Be like, oh, it's the labor economy, it's the consumer economy. The consumer economy is the labor economy and vice versa. The consumer is first the laborer. So there's a connection here, which is why we are studying small business. Small business, to answer your question more specifically, according to NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, they are probably one of the best sources for small business information. They've been putting out a chart. We put this in number 7 of our tweet thread this morning. They're not doing well. They're not feeling well. There's news coming out a lot over the last couple of weeks about, missing rent payments and closing businesses and what have you. We think by the time the story is written on 2022 and the pandemic, is we might have done a little bit too little too late for small business, and they may not be a surviving class, of business out of the pandemic. So we're very concerned about it.
Yeah, and I think that's you often hear the term zombie companies when it comes to small cap names in the U.S. I mean, you've got to assume there's a lot of zombie small businesses that have been also propped up by the same dynamic, ultra low rates, and now the shock of higher rates. That's not going to be a problem until that debt rolls over for these small businesses. But it does seem that you're going to start seeing some real shutdowns of various smaller businesses, and that alone would cause significant upticks in unemployment, in feeling that the future's not going to look as good as it was, right? So it is going to be interesting, I think, to see how the debt dynamic of small businesses plays out in the context of higher for longer rates.
The emergency disaster loans, which was the 4th tranche of support offered to small businesses. So you have PPP1, PPP2, that's the payroll protection plan. Then you had the employee retention credit. All 3 of those basically acted as true stimulus, no strings attached, by and large. Okay. If you're able to just generally demonstrate, that you did what you said you were going to do with the money that you actually, quote, borrowed. The emergency disaster loan, went to 4 million of the 32 billion small businesses in the United States of America. So about 13-14%, right, of the total SMBs. About 90% of those 4 million loans went to businesses that had fewer than 9 or 10 employees, right? So very, very, very small businesses were the ones that needed the most help. Now, the term duration, as well as the rate on the emergency disaster loan, is actually really fairly inexpensive debt. We actually took it for one of our portfolio companies, and we kind of just lowered their cost of debt by doing it, because I have, a professional CFA accountant, kind of working with them. Not everybody has access to a CALA, right? But, CALA has that ability to gift that to these small businesses and help them renegotiate some terms with their banks and what have you, in a way that was, probably far better than they would have been able to do on their own, because she built models and what have you, right? Now, so we're familiar with how that debt pays out with that one portfolio company. And, it went into repayment this October. And so we've been holding our breath just a wee bit about how a small business is going to feel once this debt payment goes back into repayment among kind of the 4 million that were most needy. I'm not making a direct comparison to the great financial crisis and the housing crisis, of 08, 09, but it does strike me as odd that the subprime loans represented about 13 to 14% of overall mortgage loans. And here we are with about 13 to 14% of the emergency disaster loans as represented by small business. It was just, when I was doing some deep work on that, it was hard to shake that comparison.
And, we're seeing some of these layoffs with some of these mega cap names now, aside from Musk with Twitter, right? Facebook laying off quite a few employees. This is more just a curiosity thing in terms of lead lag relationships, Neely. But typically, from your research, you find that you end up seeing the very large cap companies lay off first, and then because it's more fragmented, smaller companies start to then do layoffs, or is there no sort of dynamic where the large act first and everybody else acts last?
That's knowable. I don't actually know the answer to that question off the top of my head, but it's knowable. So we can follow up and have some fun on Twitter with that later. I love a good research homework exercise. But I think it makes sense, though, that, big companies would probably lay off first before small companies, just because they probably quote, over ordered their labor to begin with. And I think that's possibly what we're seeing. And at this point, like for small businesses, for those that have stuck with those businesses, if they haven't been already tempted to go to a bigger business at this point with quit ratios and job turnovers and what have you, I mean, they're probably lifers, right? Kind of committed to a cause and to a mission would be my hypothesis, but it's knowable, but I don't know that quite.
Yeah, no, again, I'm just thinking out loud. I mean, it's interesting to me, right? Because if you end up having mega cap companies moving first and laying off a lot of people, then you have an increase in the amount of labor that's out there, which has been a problem for small businesses, which is why wages have gone up. So in a weird way, you could see maybe even a reallocation of labor where the mega cap companies are basically releasing people. Now you can actually have downward pressure on wages that maybe small businesses can take advantage of because they're not responding right away. Right? I'm trying to think more in those terms. I don't know if that's valid or not, but it seems like that's not impossible in terms of the way that could play out.
Everything's a possibility. I think this is where probably one of the things I appreciate a great deal about you, Michael, is that you consider the unconsidered. And that just so is my vibe and my tribe. I mean, I love actually holding two oppositional views at the same time in my brain. I know it drives some people crazy, but like I genuinely enjoy that exercise of critical thinking. So I don't know, but I think it's something that we can train our eyes and our brains to scan for that, as those new events kind of unfold. But there is some good news. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Give us some good news, because on these spaces, I know. It's almost always negative narrative.
Exactly. I was like, it cannot just be negative news. There actually is some good news. And this is the third question, we've been raising with our leadership teams and boards. And that's, is there going to be a millennial baby boom that actually brings unexpected joy to our economy? And this might actually go into that worker question that you just asked. We think it's being probably grossly overlooked. Millennials have actually purchased millions of cars and homes over the last couple of years. And we believe, this is a debatable point, but we believe it's largely because they're either having babies or wanting to have babies. Like they actually want to complete this household formation dynamic. There's a ton of debate about that point. But we we shared a picture of some of the provisional birth data towards the end of 2021, just coming out of the pent-up demand for baby making alone from the pandemic. You actually saw a huge pop in births at the end of 21. It has since subsequently kind of come back down. We think there's one particular month that's weighing on it the most. It's May of down about 14% in that month. If you do the math on that and kind of go back to like, when were people having babies or not having babies, it totally aligns with the Delta wave of COVID. So it could be that people just like paused their activity during that time frame or what have you. But to make sure we didn't go into shutdown again. But it's already starting to show signs of sequential improvement since that point. Even further, we've got a picture in there that shows about bridal engagements. Bridal engagement jewelry sales in 21 were off the chain. I mean, people absolutely, single ladies, he put a ring on it, or, however this all works, right? But, people put a ring on it. And we think that probably led to what was a phenomenal 2022 wedding season. I love to be in rooms and ask people like, who went to a wedding this year? Like everybody raises their hand, right? So we do think that there is a very healthy wave of household formation going on, which makes us wildly optimistic actually about the economy and for the long haul. we just have to get through this mess, whatever this mess is right here and right now. So there is some good news there, Michael.
Let's go to some of the audience.
So property taxes are a local taxation rate. So that would require kind of a month of Sundays for me to know exactly how much property taxes represent of, each kind of MSA of the key kind of 250 or 300 service areas in the United States of America. I haven't done that research. I've been curious about that research, and I'm curious on your question. I'm wondering if you and I are thinking about the same thing, because if the question is sourced from opening up your own property tax bill, as it was when I opened up mine, let's just say I was a little, it's like I had the wind taken out of me when I saw how much my local Minneapolis assessment was. And I've been thinking like, okay, we're going to have the situation where like, this is the one bill that is shock and awe bill, because there's a couple annual shock and awe bills to the consumer. Property taxes is one of them. Insurance costs are another, particularly healthcare costs, which we think are actually on the rise as well. But here's something really fascinating. Property taxes are not actually captured in the CPI. So it's one of those things where it's going to kind of shock people when they have to pay it. And people are going to be like, what's going on with consumer consumption? So I don't know if that's the source of your question, but I've been thinking a lot about property taxes. It just doesn't roll up into the federal fiscal tax withholdings. It's a significant part of local taxation for sure. It's just not in the tax. It's not in the same in the federal taxation that we had cited earlier. And we believe it is absolutely going to be a headwind for consumer, at least in the shock and awe phase, if not in the actual payout of those taxes. So totally agree with your intuition there. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with you on that millennial dynamic. We actually wrote and authored a piece called The Years of Consumption Influence, which went into a very deep dive on why millennials are wired to be frugal and what the implications like that could mean. I mean, they're kind of the only generation that has experienced, if you look at when we say generation, we actually look at the peak population years. So not just the whole generation, but what generation has the largest kind of years of the population hump. And for millennials, the hump of the wave, like the crest of the wave, is actually 32 years old. Even though the generation goes older into the 40s, the reality is like the bulk of them are actually 32 years old this year. So when we think about millennial household formation, we're thinking about the crest of that wave kind of crashing through 32 years old, going to 33, 34, 35, et cetera. And in that piece, we did a deep dive analysis on a variety of things, but one of them was kind of a breathtaking a reality that they're kind of the only generation that's had consecutive back-to-back years of GDP declines during their population wave. And they saw the fastest increase basically in joblessness in a 6-month period, kind of a rapid joblessness, if you will, during what we call their years of consumption influence. Those years are 16 to 22 years of age. And we look at that because there's a neuroscience reason why you're looking at that, while also, that's when their brains are still forming, right? Kind of in that their pathways are still forming as to how they want to behave and respond to, while the world is also becoming more aware to them outside of their parents' control. So in doing that work, we think that millennials are absolutely frugal. And it probably helps too in our own practice. It's like N of 1. But Kayla is, she's at the peak of the millennial population, and I'm literally at the trough of the Gen X population. So like we're the perfect like peak to trough demographics in our even in our own workplace between the two of us. And it has bred a lot of interesting questions. There's a couple things, though. I hear with you on the debt aversion, and I agree with that. I mean, Target's Red Card has been a testimony to that. Nordstrom, launched a debit card in testimony to that as well. So, I mean, there's definitely case studies all around in consumerism that would point to debit over credit. However, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that millennials have borne the burden of their education out of the student loan component. So for example, if you were to think of the consumer's P&L, like their income statement, right? The debt repayment of student loans for kind of the 10 years that you have to repay your student loans, the typical duration of student loans, it was 9 to 10% of a millennials kind of P&L, consumer P&L, if you will. Gen Xers, I think it was only 1% to 2%. So it's gone up so substantially as a level of debt that they've had to pay, call it like a second mortgage almost, right? Before they can even get to a mortgage for 10 years of their lives. So they've had different elements of debt that other generations haven't had before them that I think that aid and add to that kind of frugality. I think that's a whole nother great question about, who's going to fill the management roles. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's just as simple as they will fill the vacuum of those leadership roles. I think there's going to be a lot of task automation, changes in business lines, a rethinking of managerial structures that kind of meet in the middle on that dynamic. But yeah, no, there's not a lot of us Gen Xers. So Viva la Gen X.
Speaking about generational differences, I feel like the whatever generation is the youngest now, however, whatever term it is, there's probably a lot more trust when it comes to workplace environment, a lot less than maybe is the case with older generations. I want to hear your thoughts on trust in the workplace. I know you want to talk about this, but I think it's interesting. You keep on hearing these stories about people no longer showing up to jobs. You end up having all these stories about people that are ghosting. It seems to be primarily with a younger generation. What's going on with the perception around employers and how that trust dynamic works for an employee?
Michael, this question has been the one that's captivated the most attention in our consulting business. It's been super fascinating to watch. It's almost like we bring it up we toss it like a grenade, pull the pin, throw it in the room and see what happens, and it's just been vibrant. I think because people are feeling, leaders and boards are feeling the effects of this kind of fracturing of trust. I think the first thing you need to do is go back to the beginning as to why are we even in this position? And one of the frameworks that we've been, elevating to that is you have to go back to what happened in the pandemic, in the kind of April 2020 timeframe, where it was very common for us to have rhetoric around essential versus non-essential workers. And those were terms given to us by politicians, not by business leaders, right? And I'm not here to, throw total shade at politicians, but this is a classic example of how do you lead when someone else just gets to immediately define kind of the content of your workforce? And I mean, that's what happened during the pandemic. You had 50 governors under emergency powers all of a sudden got to determine what was essential and non-essential. And you had to operate as a business owner in the middle of all that, or, publicly traded companies as well. So in that first fracturing of trust, I think it's in just the naming of essential versus non-essential. And there's some damage that was done there. We also let go of 24 million people overnight, of April 2020. And then when we let go, the vast majority of those people, we have a chart on this in the tweet thread, they were, because of the generosity of the CARES Act, there was 18 weeks of federal pandemic unemployment compensation of additional $600 a week stipends that were paid out. You had the vast majority of the people that were told, hey, you're non-essential and now you're home and we're actually going to pay you 50% more on an average annual, if you adjust it for an annualized view of your wage for those 18 weeks. So, enjoy and hope everything turns out okay for you. Well, re-entering that workplace, I think, is where the second fracturing really happened, because we asked people to come back at less wage than they were just accustomed to earning, right, or receiving. You have a situation where the coworkers that had to stay back and keep things running were not waged up at a similar level, right? And they were having to overcompensate for the people that were gone, and they got to see those people basically buy boats, cars, homes, RVs. I mean, I don't totally know, but you get the idea. That money was spent, and there's data that supports that money was spent handily. So I think the second fracturing happened on the reentry, and then the third fracturing happened when our states decided to be inconsistent with what did it mean to re-enter the workplace coming off of that federal pandemic unemployment compensation, because that wage went from $600 a week to $400 to $300, right? During the various different fiscal policy movements. But each time, each different state could have their interpretation about what it took to actually re-enter into the workplace. For example, California pretty much didn't require any job search requirements. You just had to like fill out a form and then, receive your weekly wage again, or your weekly, unemployment compensation. I'm not here to judge like people who had to do that or needed to do that. I'm just saying it fractures trust in the workplace. So I think that's actually what we're seeing with kind of high quit rates, low availability of demand for employed, coming back into workplaces not able to maybe raise the wages because they're trying to keep the lights on, not just for today, but for the next 2 years, thinking about small business there. I just think it's like this chaos that was not necessarily considered, when we had to do what we had to do with the Great Layoff. It's the Great Layoff that led to the Great Resignation, and the Great Resignation that's probably leading to the Great Reprioritization. And I think that's where we're at right now.
But I got to assume some of that trust fracturing is also just because of technology, right? I mean, you're more likely to trust your boss if you're actually able to see them, maybe not day to day, but see them in person versus doing a Zoom. And you can easily see a scenario where, because the culture is now adopting more and more working from home, that trust in general drops because there's something to being, physically face to face with somebody versus seeing them through a screen.
I think it all adds. I totally agree with you. I think the other thing I can add to that is during the pandemic, I decided that I don't do well with idle time. Okay. Like I can can handle a lot of things. I don't do well with idle time. And during the pandemic, most of our clients, retailers, brands, right, they were in the process of laying off 85% of their workforce. Like they did not need me doing any biz dev, right, for them that time frame. So, I used some of that extra time to go really deep. We actually produced some beautiful, beautiful research for all of our clients. We, side note, we actually released every single one of our clients in 2020 from having to pay their retainer, but we still treated them as though they were fully retained and actually probably gave them some of the best research and insights that they needed and, helped our clients, which, heads up, if you're ever able to do that as a consultant, totally pays off in the end. And, we're just really grateful for that partnership, but I had extra time. So I decided to become a professor. I've always wanted to teach. I've been a guest lecturer for, a decade. And so I now teach as a professor. And I will tell you, to that point that you're bringing up around technology, the student population I have the privilege of working with and serving, they have been placed at some of the highest companies here in town in Minneapolis, some of the Fortune 500. And they do extraordinarily well, to the point where our recruiters are coming back to us. They're like, we've barely heard of your school, because we're blocks away from the U, and we're a small little private non-profit school. But it's because our kids stayed in school. They didn't do the online thing. We were small enough to be nimble to keep them face to face and relating to people, even if it was mask to mask for a period of time. And I am wholly convinced that was a tiny little microcosm of the face-to-face versus digital perspective that we're now having recruiters come to us and saying, oh, who else you got over there? Like, we want more of that, because they actually know how to relate and be with people. So they know how to build trust, right, with their facial emotions. They know. So we're being competitive as a very small little school because we actually chose to be face-to-face. I think it's fascinating.
By the way, everybody here, please make sure you follow Neely on Twitter. And if you are a member of a board and you are curious and obviously get her take and see what she can do for you, reach out to her directly. Again, my name is Michael Guy. Let's go to a question.
I think about Gen Z all the time because I'm also raising a Gen Zer, and he amazes me every day. And I'm biased and I've won, but probably like you too, you see it. But let's go back to the millennials. Again, what I had said earlier around this kind of frugality and posture. I think when they first entered into the workforce, millennials were branded with this idea that they were entitled. And that bothered me for a lot of reasons. I saw what people saw, but the why behind that behavior is what needed to be understood. And I think because the millennials had grown up with such financial anxiety, and now it's expressing as frugality, what expresses as entitlement is actually the need for assurance. Like they need to know that they're on a path of success because they've been duped by the world prior to, just speaking very plainly and kind of out there. So I think what got viewed as kind of the millennials won't do is going to pivot into the Gen Zs can do. And I love this about the Gen Zers. They're very can-do minded. They've grown up with teaching themselves how to learn everything off of YouTube. I even caught my son one point, we totally coddle him in so many ways because, he's like our only son and our only child and, whatever. It is what it is. I have my vice. Coddling my son is probably one of them. But despite that, he's turning out to be a phenomenal human. And I once told him, I was like, just go heat up your macaroni and cheese. I don't need to do that for you. And I saw later on that he was Googling up how to heat up macaroni and cheese, on his Google search and tried to find how to do that answer. And I just think that that's so emblematic of what Gen Z is. So they're figuring out investing. They're extraordinarily bright when it comes to and wise about investments. We do need to improve, I think, their financial and news literacy and accuracy. I love the idea of TikTok, but I don't love TikTok. But that comes up actually as a professor. I'm sure you see that too, where they're like, well, I saw on TikTok, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay, well,
no one should love the idea of TikTok. No one should love the idea of TikTok.
But you know what I mean? No, y'all, we need to learn about primary sources. Okay, so I actually teach macro, and let's just say I'm teaching them primary sources. But anyway, so I do think that there's some beautiful things about Gen Z that again make me wildly optimistic about what this U.S. economy is going to be on the other side of whatever mess we need to get through before we get there. Gen Z is a big part of it as well. It's just testimony to the brilliance that Michael has been pulling together and lead lag report in on this space. He had a phenomenal conversation with Craig Fuller at FreightWaves, yesterday, and Craig really spoke very specifically about it. So I don't have anything more specific to add other than the experience of observation. And that is I've seen retailers overorder for years. And then they get bulked up on their inventory, and that always costs them on the margin. So I am in the camp that believes we have not seen the worst of our earnings around the corner. I think inventories are a big part of that, coupled with a slowing demand cycle or normalization of demand at the very best, if not slowing. And so, yeah, and unfortunately, I've got way too much scar tissue being a sell-side analyst in the retail sector. Well, and I think at the core of it, people forget that it's about out the door pricing. It has nothing to do with the cost of what you procured those items at. It's whether or not the customer wants to buy it at the price in which you want to sell it. And my best and favorite example is, what is Halloween? What's the value of Halloween candy on the 31st of October versus the 1st of November, right? That's what's going on. And that's what's probably going to extrapolate on the other side of holiday. So I do think they're going to have some indigestion as it relates to inventory.
Please make sure you follow Neely. And I will say on a personal note, people like Neely give me hope for Twitter. And I really am actually sincere when I say that. I've gotten a lot of very strange comments the last several weeks and months from people that don't really understand what I'm attempting to do. Neely has reached out to me personally, unprompted, give me some supportive, encouraging words. That's not lost on me. She's a good person, very knowledgeable. Make sure you follow her. I'm very appreciative of this friendship that, thankfully Twitter is allowing, and really do encourage everybody again to make sure that you follow good people. Don't follow people who are not good people, because that might be telling you something about your subconscious and who you actually are. Neely's a good person, so make sure you follow her.
Michael, I really appreciate that. And if I may, because you've opened up the door to go and be a little more personal here, I have observed what you've been building since the time I had a sponsored ad for Michael Guyed in my feed. And I have to tell you, you are a kind, curious, and good human. And I know you speak often about the indelible mark that your dad has left on you. I know that he would say how proud he is of you. And it's just an honor. It's such an honor to actually be in the space with you, sir. So thank you so much.